postgraduates will be joining. Today evening is very special. We'll have two topics. One is on corneal dystrophy and other is on interstitial keratitis. We have with us Dr. Rajesh Fogla, who was our teacher in Shankar Netralaya, and we have Dr. Sumanna Chatterjee, who is a consultant at BBI Foundation, Kolkata. We have moderator with us, Dr. Mamta Singh, who is a consultant at Regional Institute of Ophthalmology, IGIMS, Patna. And I would like to request Dr. Mamta to please take over the session. Dr. Mamta, please.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Welcome all of those trainers. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Fogla, sir, and Dr. Sumana Chatterjee. We have this first talk today on the topic of corneal dystrophy. Am I audible for everyone? Am I audible, sir, there?
Yeah. You can hold the mic little away, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Fine, sir. So first up, we have Dr. Rajesh Fogla, sir, and he is a consultant, a senior consultant at Apollo Eye Hospital, Hyderabad. And if you are a graduate who is thinking of having a career in the field of corneal refractive surgery, then you should really listen carefully today because it can't get better than this when Dr. Fogla is talking about corneal dystrophy. So let's start and we'll have the first talk by Dr. Fogla.
Yeah, so can you see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Satyajit for inviting me in this postgraduate teaching program. And I would also like to thank Dr. Mamta Singh and Dr. Sumana, who's there as a co-presenter for this session. Now, when we talk about corneal dystrophy, there is a background noise that's coming. If others can mute their mic, it would be helpful. Yeah, that's much better. So corneal dystrophy. When we talk about corneal dystrophy, this is a group of inherited condition. The origin is basically a genetic mutation, which leads to abnormal deposition of materials within a normal corneal structure. And these deposits are usually proteinaceous in nature. They start early in childhood and they are slowly progressive. They are bilaterally symmetrical, but the patient may present clinically in the third or fourth decade when it starts affecting the vision. There is no external or environmental influence on the origin of corneal dystrophies. There is a very nice classification given by the International Committee for Classification of Corneal Dystrophies, called the I3CD. If you Google this, you will find on their website and a very detailed classification and description of all the corneal dystrophies is also given, along with good clinical photographs. Now, corneal dystrophies, when a patient presents to you, they can present with symptoms of surface problems with recurrent corneal erosion. They can present with decrease in visual acuity from the deposits, which may be in terms of glare, ghosting, photophobia, or they can present with blurred vision resulting from corneal edema from a dysfunctional endothelium. Now, the dystrophy can affect all the layers of the cornea. So you have the epithelial and subepithelial dystrophies, the stromal dystrophies, and the endothelial dystrophies. So there is a long list of conditions. Do we see all of them in our clinical practice? Very unlikely. Even in my past almost 22 years of practice in cornea, I may have seen almost 80% of them, but not some of them are still very rare. So it takes a very long period of time to be able to come across most of these dystrophies. The common ones that you see are the epithelial basement membrane dystrophy. You can see the recurrent corneal erosion dystrophies. You can see respucular corneal dystrophy. The lattice, granular, and macular dystrophies are also not uncommon. And often you will come across Fuchs endothelial dystrophy and congenital hereditary endothelial dystrophy. So if you suspect a corneal dystrophy, some of the things that help you in the diagnosis are because it's an inherited disorder, often you will find that there would be a positive history of other family members being affected. Also, are there any signs of inflammation? Because usually corneal dystrophies are non-inflammatory. So if you have any signs of inflammation, then most likely you're dealing with something else and not a dystrophy. Look at, always, if you find, don't make a diagnosis by looking just at one eye, always observe the other eye. If you have a corneal dystrophy, it's more likely to be bilaterally symmetrical or asymmetric. And you can also find out which layers are affected, whether it's affecting throughout the cornea or only a particular layer is affected. There is one microphone that's still giving me some background noise. So if someone who has joined in and microphone is still on, you can switch it off. And make a note of whether there are clear zones in between the lesions. Do the lesions extend to the limbus, or the cornea abnormally thin or normal thickness? Because once you get all these questions, once you get the answer to all the questions, you will be able to pinpoint as to what kind of corneal dystrophy you are dealing with. Now let's start from the surface. Epithelial basement membrane dystrophy, also known as map.fingerprint dystrophy. It's basically an epithelial and basement membrane abnormality where there is duplication of the basement membrane, resulting in all these patterns of which look like a map or various dots on the cornea, or sometimes it can resemble something like a fingerprint. Because there are no definite inheritance pattern for these dystrophies, because it affects the basement membrane, it affects the adhesion of the epithelium to the underlying Bowman's layer. So you get more chance of having recurrent erosions. And also because the epithelium becomes irregular, you can have blurred vision, ghosting, glare while driving at night. There is a slight female preponderance, and clinically the patients usually they present to you in the third decade. The treatment in the initial phase is usually symptomatic, mainly lubricants. And if there is presence of recurrent corneal erosion, then you may consider debriding the loose epithelium, putting a bandage contact lens for 2 to 4 weeks to allow the epithelium to heal. And even after that, if the condition does not resolve, you may have to consider doing an excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy. This basically removes the unhealthy basement membrane while ablation with the excimer laser. And the new epithelium that resurfaces the cornea is able to get a better grip on the underlying layer, and you have less chance of recurrence of the recurrent erosions. This is just to show you a clinical case. On the right side, you see there has a epithelial basement membrane dystrophy, for which we did an excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy, and the image on the left shows you the post-op appearance where you see that the cornea is relatively clear. So this was a patient who did not have recurrent erosion, but he was visually symptomatic. And when we did a topography, we found that the topography did show surface irregularities. You can even do an anterior segment OCT, which can also show you an abnormal thickened epithelium and a highly reflective basement membrane. The other dystrophy, which is quite rare, is the Meesmann dystrophy. This is autosomal dominant. You get these bleb-like vesicles within the epithelium, appears early in life, usually not visually symptomatic. And these lesions can often extend to the corneal periphery as well. They are seen quite well if you see them against the retroillumination. As I mentioned, they are asymptomatic, but if you do have some patients with some symptoms, you can usually manage them with topical lubricants. The other condition which you may come across is the gelatinous drop-like corneal dystrophy, quite rare in our population, more common in the Japanese population. It's an autosomal recessive dystrophy. You get amyloid deposits in the subepithelium and the anterior stroma. It appears early in life. Exposure to UV light has a tendency to worsen the eye condition, so avoiding UV exposure has been recommended. Patients are usually very photophobic. Even in clinic, when you see these cases, it becomes very difficult to examine. So I borrowed some photographs from the internet because I do have cases with gelatinous droplet, but we have never been able to take good clinical photographs because the patients are so photophobic. They often require intervention because the lesions on the surface tend to irritate the eye. In the initial stage, you can do like a superficial debridement, put a bandage contact lens in, but often the underlying stroma gets involved, and then you have to resort to doing an anterior lamellar keratoplasty. There is a very high rate of recurrence, and usually over a period of 3 to 4 years, you may have to resort to superficial debridement or performing an excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy to smoothen the surface. And if the stroma gets involved, you may need to repeat the lamellar keratoplasty. The other epithelial and anterior stromal dystrophy is the Reese-Buckler corneal dystrophy. It's autosomal dominant. Here, the Bowman's layer is replaced by connective tissue. It appears early in life, decreases vision, also induces photophobia because the lesions are in the visual axis, and it can also result in recurrent corneal erosions. And it has a kind of a net-like appearance when you see on the surface. I'll show you some more clinical photographs. So this is a patient with bilateral Reese-Buckler corneal dystrophy. You can see it's quite symmetrical. It involves a central 60 to 70% of the cornea. So there are some clear spaces in between, and the patient is able to see through these spaces. So although the lesion looks quite widespread on the cornea, but visually they can still maintain a fair amount of vision despite having significant corneal involvement. Now, this gentleman was a 55-year-old gentleman, and he presented with a decrease in vision, mainly from the fact that he had started developing early cataract, and that led to a worsening of his symptom, and then we had to consider a combined approach to treat the cornea and the cataract as well. Now, this is a patient. You can see that the top image is the earlier image. A year later, you can see that the Reese-Buckler lesions have become more confluent, and at that point of time, she was symptomatic. We had two options in this scenario. Either we could do an excimer laser to ablate the superficial cornea to remove the lesions. The excimer laser can be safely performed up to about 100, 110 microns. But if you have lesions deeper than that, then you have to think about doing a superficial anterior lamellar keratoplasty. So in this case, we did a femtosecond laser-assisted superficial anterior lamellar keratoplasty, and the image on the left, you can see it's a post-operative image showing a nice clear graph. There are few lesions, the deeper lesions, which are still present, but a majority of the lesions involving the anterior cornea have been removed in the lamellar graft. Among the stromal dystrophies, you have the lattice corneal dystrophy, which is again an autosomal dominant condition. Here you get deposits of amyloid within the anterior corneal stroma. It appears in the 3rd to 4th decade. Patient can present with decrease in vision, photophobia, and erosion. Commonly, this condition, because of the recurrent erosion and the appearance of the lattice lines, is often misdiagnosed as a viral keratitis, and the patients are treated with topical antivirals for a pretty long period of time. And because the topical antivirals are usually epitheliotoxic, it worsens the recurrent erosions, and the patients remain symptomatic for a pretty longer period of time. So in such situations, sometimes you can, if the condition is only superficial, you can think about doing excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy to smoothen the anterior corneal surface, allowing the healthy epithelium to resurface. Or if the involvement of the anterior stroma is also there, you can think about doing a lamellar keratoplasty. Just to show you two clinical photographs. So if you see them in just diffuse illumination, sometimes the lattice lines may not be seen. So you have to either use a retro-illumination against a widely dilated pupil, or you have to use reflected light from the iris by using tangential illumination. And against the reflected light, you can see these refractile lesions. Sometimes they look like prominent corneal nerves, so you might misdiagnose them as neurofibromatosis with prominent corneal nerves as well. But they are very typical, and this is what it looks like. And if you have recurrent corneal erosions, you have to watch out. So always, if in one eye, if you suspect, it's always important to examine the fellow eye. Granular corneal dystrophy is the other relatively common stromal dystrophy that we come across in clinical practice. Again, it is autosomal dominant. Here, the deposits are hyaline deposits. You have two types, granular dystrophy 1 and the granular dystrophy 2. When you just have hyaline deposits, it's called the avellinodystrophy. When you have a mix of hyaline and amyloid deposits, it's also called the granular dystrophy 2 or the gronewdystrophy. Typically, again, patients present in 3rd to 4th decade. again with decrease in vision, photophobia, and erosions if the superficial layers are involved. Again, the treatment basically remains on which layers are involved. If it is superficial, we always take the help of excimer laser to try and ablate the superficial corneal stroma to remove these lesions and achieve a clear cornea. Just to show you some examples, that these are two different patients with granular corneal dystrophy. The typical appearance of breadcrumbs dispersed on the anterior cornea is seen. What you will see that these lesions are discrete, they have very sharp margins, and the intervening space is clear. And they can involve from the surface to the anterior stroma, or they can be dispersed widely in the stroma, especially the granular dystrophy type. One is dispersed throughout the cornea. So here you can see this, the image on the left is an image taken with the sclerotic scatter. Here you can see the granular dystrophy deposits light up pretty well. So you can use sclerotic scatter illumination to try and improve the visualization of these deposits. So in this case, the lesions were fairly superficial. So we did an excimer laser phototherapeutic keratectomy. And then you can see this is the postoperative appearance that shows you a fairly clear cornea. So this will remain like that for the next 3 to 4 years before these deposits appear again. And if the corneal thickness is sufficient, you can do a repeat excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy. The disadvantage of doing multiple excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy is that you remove tissue from the central cornea that results in flattening. So it can produce a hyperopic shift, which sometimes may not be very desirable for the patient, especially if the patient is in the presbyopic age group. Now here, this is a granular dystrophy where the involvement was involving almost 2/3 of the corneal stroma. And this can be seen very well on anterior segment OCT. So anterior segment OCT is a useful diagnostic tool to help decide what treatment modality you're going to use. So on anterior corneal dystrophy, if you see that the lesions are fairly superficial, you can think about doing an excimer phototherapeutic keratectomy. If the lesions are in the anterior 200 microns of cornea, you can think about doing a superficial anterior lamellar keratoplasty, which can be either performed using a microkeratome or the femtosecond laser. But if the lesions are deeper than that, then you perform maybe a deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty, like what I performed in this case. And the image on the left shows you the post-op appearance, where you can see a nice clear corneal graft. The other stromal dystrophy is the macular corneal dystrophy. So this is the only stromal dystrophy which is autosomal recessive. And the deposits here are glycosylmonoglycans. And the difference is that here the lesions can extend to the periphery. And unlike other dystrophies which have clear space in between lesions, here there is no clear space. So if you carefully examine the cornea, you will find the intervening stroma will look a little hazy, and the margins of the lesions are also not sharply defined. Macular corneal dystrophy can also be associated with decreased endothelial function. And because the corneal stroma lacks keratan sulfate, despite having poor endothelial function, the cornea paradoxically is thinner. It usually presents again in 3rd to 4th decade with the patient becoming symptomatic with visual disturbance. And often, although in certain cases when the lesions are superficial, you can do the similar procedure using the excimer laser. But in a majority of cases, we need to do some form of corneal transplantation. Again, here you have to be careful. Unlike other dystrophies where lamellar keratoplasty can be performed, the advantage of lamellar keratoplasty is that you retain the host endothelium, thereby you avoid endothelial rejection, and you don't need to use steroids for a very long period of time. But here, because advanced macular corneal dystrophy can be associated with poor endothelial function, doing an anterior lamellar keratoplasty may not solve the problem. So this is one stromal dystrophy where you may have to do a full thickness penetrating keratoplasty. So this is again a patient with macular dystrophy. This is early macular dystrophy, so the lesions are more central. But if you examine the cornea carefully, you may find some lesions extending to the periphery as well. And if you see carefully between the lesions, you will find that the intervening stroma is not as clear as what you see in granular dystrophy. So in this case, an excimer laser phototherapeutic keratectomy was performed. This is in the initial postoperative period where the cornea looks clear, but this patient had an abnormal response. And when we examined this patient a year later, he had some amount of subepithelial haze developing, which is known to occur when you do excimer laser surface ablation. So here we had done almost 100, 110 microns of stromal ablation, and since the endothelial function we know associated with this is not very good, we did not use mitomycin C for a very long duration of time, and that due to that we had an early recurrence of subepithelial haze, which required us to use steroids for a longer period of time. In this case, the lesions were extending deeper. So this is a case where we did a anterior lamellar keratoplasty, taking into consideration that the patient may have a poor endothelial function and may require some form of endothelial keratoplasty at a later date. Again, a rare stromal dystrophy is the Schneider corneal dystrophy. I would have seen maybe only 2 cases in my entire clinical practice. Again, autosomal dominant. This is a lipid disorder in the cornea. So you get basically deposition of lipid crystals in the subepithelium and the anterior stroma. Can be associated with dent arcus lipidus, present in the 3rd to 4th decade. These patients often have an abnormal lipid profile as well, so should be evaluated systemically for the same. So giving you the differences, which again from the exam point of view is important, because in the stromal dystrophies you have the granular, lattice, Schneider, and macular. So you need to know what kind of deposit. We know that in granular you have the hyaline deposit. In type 2 granular you have a combination of hyaline and amyloid. Lattice is typically amyloid deposit. In Schneider you get the lipid or cholesterol deposits. Macular you have the glycosaminoglycan. And you need to have some idea of what exactly stains take place in the histopathological specimen. Hyaline, basically, if you have, it can stain with the Masson trichrome. The amyloid can stain with Congo red. You have the glycosaminoglycan that stain with the Alcian blue, and the lipid stains with the oil red O or the Sudan black. Now coming to the endothelium, the Fuchs endothelial corneal dystrophy is, I think in the clinical practice, this is relatively common. And we do see a fair bit of number, could be possibly because of referral practice. This is autosomal dominant, may have a slight more male preponderance. You get abnormal endothelium with guttate, which are basically abnormal deposits on the Descemet's membrane, which are seen as excrescences. You get a beaten metal appearance of the Descemet's membrane when you make a fine slit and look at the endothelium under high magnification. Typically, the patients present in 4th to 5th decade, although some of these changes can be seen in younger patients as well, but they don't develop early corneal edema. And it's always important to examine patients when they are undergoing cataract surgery. Besides looking at the cataract, one should also look at the cornea, because often this can get missed. And if you operate on the cataract, you can have an undesirable postoperative corneal edema, which may not resolve despite giving medical management. These guttate changes typically start in the center and spread peripherally. And initially, the corneal early edema can be managed medically using topical lubricants and hyperosmotics. And later on, when these changes progress, you have to do surgical management. In advanced stages, we do a replacement of the endothelium and the Descemet's membrane using either Descemet stripping automated endothelial keratoplasty, where you have a donor carrier stroma with the healthy Descemet's membrane and the endothelium, which is transplanted into the eye through a small incision. Or you can do the isolated transfer of the Descemet's membrane alone with the healthy endothelium, which is called Descemet's membrane endothelial keratoplasty, which again has a much faster visual recovery, induces a less refractive shift, and has better refractive outcome. And out of all the endothelial keratoplasty procedures, DMEK has the lowest risk of endothelial rejection. So compared to a full thickness penetrating keratoplasty, the DMEK procedure almost has 15 to 20 times lower risk of endothelial rejection. So, and it does not have the suture-related complications. So that's why for Fuchs endothelial dystrophy, the choice of procedure these days is doing a Descemet's membrane endothelial keratoplasty. So this is the clinical appearance of a patient. This is a young patient presenting with corneal edema. You can see that there is a central corneal edema. You can see the guttate changes, and these guttate changes they are more dense in the center and extend to the periphery. And on the specular microscopy, you can see the guttate changes, which are seen as dark areas among the mosaic of endothelial cells. This is a patient, young patient with Fuchs endothelial dystrophy, where you have the central corneal edema. This was a 48-year-old male, and he was symptomatic, and he was not responding to the medical management. So in this case, we performed Descemet's membrane endothelial keratoplasty. This was done through a 2.6 millimeter incision, and this is the post-operative appearance where you can't even make out that any surgery has been done, and the cornea has become very clear, and he regained good visual acuity. And later on, if he requires a cataract surgery later, it can be performed in the normal manner, and which is likely to give a much better refractive outcome than performing a penetrating keratoplasty. Posterior polymorphous corneal dystrophy is also another form of endothelial dystrophy, relatively uncommon, again has autosomal dominant inheritance. You get abnormal endothelium with thickened Descemet's membrane. Typical appearances could be in the form of vesicles, which are located in the Descemet's membrane. These are basically reduplication of the endothelial cells. So instead of a monolayer of endothelial cells, in this condition, you get multi-layered endothelial cells. You could get snail track appearance, where you get a band-like lesion with scalloped edges, as you see in the second photograph. And they can also be assessed because these are endothelial cells that behave like epithelium or the fibroblasts. In the periphery, you can get features of peripheral anterior synechiae, and there is a risk incidence of almost 14% incidence of secondary glaucoma associated with posterior polymorphous corneal dystrophy. So you again, when you get corneal edema, the medical or surgical management is the same as what you get with Fuchs endothelial dystrophy. However, if the patient has glaucoma, then that needs to be addressed as well. In children, sometimes they can present with congenital hereditary endothelial dystrophy. Initially, it was thought of having type 1 and type 2. Now, basically, they know that the type 1 is basically something similar to posterior polymorphous dystrophy. So you basically have the congenital hereditary endothelial dystrophy type 2, which is described as CHED. It is also autosomal recessive. Here you have abnormal endothelium. So you have an endothelium that secretes abnormal Descemet's membrane. So you have the banded and the non-banded portion. So you get thickening of the non-banded portion of the Descemet's membrane. And you get diffuse corneal edema, where the corneal can thicken almost up to 1.5 to twice the normal thickness. You get stromal thickening, but somehow you don't get too much of epithelial edema, as you see with other endothelial dysfunction syndrome. So patients typically present with decreased vision. They can have photophobia. And because of poor vision in childhood, they can develop amblyopia and nystagmus as well. The surgical management is basically replacement of the endothelium. If you do a penetrating keratoplasty, you get much clearer cornea. But again, you have the suture-related problem, astigmatism, amblyopia management becomes a little bit difficult because of the variable refraction. If you do an endothelial keratoplasty, like Descemet stripping endothelial keratoplasty or Descemet membrane endothelial keratoplasty, the advantage is you get a much better refractive outcome because the cornea does not have any incisions or sutures on that. But the corneal clarity is not as good as what you see with penetrating keratoplasty. However, the amblyopia management becomes much better because the postoperative refraction is much more regular, and you can give glasses much easily. So these are two images of two different patients of CHED. You can see the thickened cornea where Descemet's membrane endothelial keratoplasty was performed, and you can see the postoperative appearance where the cornea looks fairly clear. When you do an endothelial keratoplasty, you use a large air or a gas bubble to provide tamponade to hold the donor lenticule in place. Now, this donor lenticule needs the support from the air bubble or the gas bubble, otherwise it would detach. And if you keep a complete air fill or a gas fill inside the anterior chamber, there is a very high incidence of developing a pupillary block. So you see in both these photographs, there is the inferior peripheral iridectomy that's been performed. So the inferior peripheral iridectomy avoids the development of pupillary block. So this is an important step when you perform an endothelial keratoplasty. So why is it important that we should know about corneal dystrophy? It's important because sometimes you need to differentiate between degenerative corneal lesions and dystrophies, because often you may see a corneal dystrophy and label it as a corneal degeneration, or you may be seeing a corneal degenerative lesion and you may misdiagnose it as a dystrophy. So the clinical management and the course of the disease may be, they do differ between dystrophies and degeneration. So in terms of laterality, the degenerations are usually unilateral, dystrophies are bilateral. As we have seen in the previous photograph, you get symmetrical appearance, clinical appearance in dystrophies. Degenerations are usually very asymmetrical. The degenerations are usually peripheral in location. If you name a few degenerative conditions like lipid keratopathy, they will have vascularization under lipid keratopathy. You may have spheroidal degenerations. You may have Salzmann nodular degeneration. The dystrophies are inherited. That means you may have family members who have similar disease, where in degeneration, this is unlikely. And dystrophies are non-inflammatory, whereas degenerations will have some inflammation. They may have blood vessels in the cornea. Dystrophies, although have early onset, they may present late clinically, but these findings can be noted even in the first or second decade, whereas degenerative lesions are usually in the late onset. Dystrophies usually involve a particular layer of the cornea, like the epithelium, stroma, or the endothelium, whereas in degeneration, they don't respect these boundaries. You can have multiple layers involvement. Dystrophies typically are very slowly progressive over several years, whereas degenerative lesions can be more progressive depending on the lesion and the surface inflammation. So this is in short a coverage of the corneal dystrophies. And I think I've given you a perspective both from a clinician's point of view. In terms of theory, you can definitely read up and have some more idea about the histopathologic appearance of all these lesions, which is again important. And the other rare dystrophies, which I may not have covered adequately in this, you can definitely go through them. Thank you. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you for this wonderful talk, and it was really elaborate. At the same time, keeping it interesting. This is actually really tough for this particular topic. We have a question also. What is ghosting? Probably cement ghosting of images.
I'm not able to hear your question. Your microphone, the voice is not very.
There is one question here. What is
Yes.
ghosting? What is ghosting? Ghosting of images.
Mamta, we can't hear you.
Sir, can you ask the question, sir?
You can remove the ear and the microphone and
Maybe if you're doing from a laptop, just use the microphone of the laptop. You can remove. There is some problem with the headphone, I think.
Is this okay, sir, now?
Yeah, much better.
Yes, sir. One question is, sir, what is ghosting? Probably she meant ghosting of images. Okay, I'm not talking about. Suppose
remove the earphone. Huh?
Can you please ask the question, sir, if it is audible from your end?
Yeah, now it's better. Now you can just speak like that.
Sorry. There is one question. What is ghosting? Probably she meant the ghosting of images.
Yeah, ghosting. See, one is ghosting is what the patient responds, because the patient has surface irregularity. So he'll come and tell you the ghosting of the letters. I don't know what measure. If you look at me, clinical looking at the cornea ghosting, it means blood vessels which are no longer active. You see ghost vessels, so there you can call ghosting. So,
yeah. And sir, if you have to recommend one book as a postgraduate to read this particular topic, then it would be like one book to read, corneal dystrophy.
No, it depends on how much of information you want on dystrophies. If you go on Google and look at the site on corneal dystrophies, there is actually a website on corneal dystrophies which gives you very much details about it, but then it goes too much into the genetics of inheritance, which is the gene mutation. It gives you all the clinical parameters. It gives very good clinical photographs, and it also gives you the histopathological photographs as well. And there are few articles on PubMed as well, which are full text. You can download them. But I have found very easy. If you look at the Kansky clinical ophthalmology or the Kansky Atlas, these photographs are pretty good. And you can also look at the American Academy Basic Science Clinical Course. That also gives you very relevant information. So I think from an exam point of view, this is what you need to have an idea about. What are the conditions that can affect the epithelial or the subepithelial layer of the cornea? What are the stromal dystrophies? And it's important to know about dystrophies because they can be often confused with other clinical conditions.
As you said, with degeneration and all. Yeah.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. And sir, can you tell in a very simple manner the difference between DSEC and DMEC? Because many of the postgraduates who are here, they are actually first-year residents. So it's tough for them to actually understand the concept of DSEC and DMEC separately. There's just no posterior lamellar keratoplasty.
Yeah, so both are posterior lamellar keratoplasty. It's something like extracapsular cataract surgery and phacoemulsification. Both are cataract surgeries, but you do extracapsular cataract surgery through a larger wound. You do phacoemulsification through a smaller wound. So the difference between DSEC and DMEC is that when we transfer the donor lenticule into the eye, in DSEC, we use some amount of the stroma to act as a carrier for the endothelium and the Decimus membrane. So that means the donor lenticule transplanted into the eye is thicker. In DMEC, there is no stroma. It's just the isolated Decimus membrane that you are peeling from the donor and transplanting it into the eye. Both are placed in the same position. So the advantage is that in DSEC, you will get change in the posterior curvature because you have a thicker lenticule that's there. So that also helps clear the cornea. It gives very good vision. But DMEC is anatomically much more beneficial because it does not alter the posterior corneal curvature. And because less amount of stroma is transplanted in DMEC, so the stromal keratocytes are much less. So less antigen presenting cells, so lower stimulus for endothelial rejection.
Thank you so much, sir. And I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you again. And we'll shift to the next talk now. That is by Dr. Sumana Chatterjee, cornea consultant from, thank you, sir. From Dr. Sumana, welcome you. And she is working at BBI Eye Foundation, Kolkata. Very good cornea and ocular surface surgeon. And we welcome you with the talk, Dr. Sumana.
Thanks, Mamta. Okay. So, at the outset, am I audible? Mamta, am I audible? Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, Dr. Sumana.
Okay. At the outset, I thank Dr. Singha for giving the opportunity. Always pleasure to talk after Dr. Mansur himself and such a comprehensive talk on. I think if someone records that talk and listens it again and again, the whole topic will be covered very soon. So I have kept it small. After such a long discussion on this topic, the interstitial keratitis, this topic is a small one, but it is a very important one. So please change the slide. Next one. Next slide, please.
Yeah, ma'am. Just a minute. Yes, ma'am. Can you see?
So by definition, it is a non-ulcerating inflammation of the corneal stroma without the involvement of either the epithelium or endothelium. All the words in this definition are very much important because more or less they summarize the whole topic. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is a common endpoint for a number of diseases which primarily manifest as inflammation and vascularization of the corneal stroma with minimal loss of tissue. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So by etiology, it can be of infectious origin or it can be immunological. Most common etiologies are presently herpes simplex virus and syphilis. In yesteryears, whenever we were discussing about the interstitial keratitis, it was almost synonymous with syphilis. But nowadays, herpes has taken over. Next slide. So among the bacterial etiologies, syphilis being still most common, Lyme disease, tuberculosis, leprosy, brucellosis, leptospirosis. Next. Among the viral etiologies, herpes simplex, herpes zoster, Epstein-Barr virus, HLTV1, mumps, measles, vaccinia, variola are the common pathogens. Next, the common parasites are onchocerciasis, acanthamoeba, leishmaniasis, trypanosomiasis, and mycosporidiasis. Next, the most common immune etiologies being Cogan syndrome, sarcoidosis, autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, vaginal granulomatosis. Next, mycosis fungoides, contact lens related keratitis, and intracorneal foreign body. Next, when we start discussing about the pathophysiology, in bacterial and parasitic interstitial keratitis, it can be the direct invasion of the corneal stroma or post-allergic or immune reaction to foreign antigens. Next, if we come in viral interstitial keratitis, it is usually the viral antigen in the corneal stroma, but whether it is an active infection, it is still not clear. Next. Next. Yeah, so diagnosis is mainly clinical. The non-ulcerative stromal keratitis have to be stressed on. So the no involvement of epithelium and endothelium, only the presence of stromal reaction gives a key to the diagnosis to interstitial keratitis. Patients usually present with decreased vision, photophobia, and pain. Next. In the history, it is very important to take a meticulous history because history itself will help you differentiate between different causes of interstitial. Very important to inquire about the constitutional symptoms, including hearing loss or short. It is important to take previous history of herpetic infection or any other. Next, so the exposure history to insect bites, animals, and environment. If you remember about the parasitic causes of leishmaniasis or the onchocerciasis, this history becomes very relevant. For the Lyme disease, insect bite becomes very relevant. A travel history to endemic regions of the disease, sexually transmitted disease. Next. Next. Contact lens wear, medication use, and history. So this is a very typical picture. What is this? This is Hutchinson's tip. In congenital syphilis, we do not see these things very often nowadays, but it was common in yesteryears. This congenital syphilis was common in presenting between 5 to 15 years of age, and it was bilateral. Next. If it is an acquired syphilis or tubercular interstitial keratitis, they are usually unilateral. Next. And in leprosy, it is bilateral and always infected. So how does it present in the acute phase? You can always see the conjunctival congestion and active stromal inflammation. You can see stromal cells, you can see stromal edema. Next. Next. In the chronic presentation, it is very important. See for stromal neovascularization. This is almost the hallmark of interstitial keratitis, lipid keratopathy, and you can always see the corneal haze. Next, in the quiescent phase, there is scar with ghost vessels, and these ghost vessels are very much prominent when you see in retroillumination. Next, so you will always hear this term, that is the salmon patch appearance. What is that? It is also known as Hutchinson's patch. What happens in syphilitic interstitial keratitis, the cellular infiltration and edema, they obscure the neovascularization. So it came as a characteristic pinkish appearance of salmon patch. Next. Now, this gentleman had this presentation bilaterally. Next. He gave history of hearing loss and vertigo. See the importance of history. So the presentation was like faint bilateral peripheral anterior stromal corneal opacities, which progressed to deeper opacification and neovascularization. So what is this? This is the Cogan syndrome with the classical triad of interstitial keratitis, vestibulo-auditory disease, and autoimmune vasculitis. If patient presents to you initially, you have to refer him or her promptly to rheumatologist, as there is associated polyarteritis nodosa, Wegener's granulomatosis, or rheumatoid arthritis. Next. So what are the investigations? You can always do a pachymetry to see the corneal thickness. As acanthamoeba is always a difficult diagnosis, and if you are in a dilemma and have access to confocal microscopy, it is always best to go for a confocal. You can also do a PCR to diagnose any infective etiology, because as it is a stromal thing, it is often difficult to get anything positive in the smear or the culture. So PCR comes as immense help in this situation. Next, you have to rule out syphilis. So RPR, VDRL, FTA, ABS, and all of these things you need to do. HIV testing becomes must in certain situations. To rule out tuberculosis, you have to do chest X-ray, PPD, quantiferon gold, and always exclude immunological causes by doing a rheumatoid factor and ANA. Next. So if you are suspecting Lyme disease, then Lyme titers by ELISA. And if you are suspecting Cogan syndrome, always do TC-DC ESR, along with that HLA-B17 and serology for HSP70 antibodies. Next. So what comes in differential diagnosis? Comes the role of the definition. So what we told in the definition, that epithelium and endothelium is not affected. So this is how we will differentiate from acute ulcerative keratitis, either infectious or immune, from the endothelial disease, which can result in secondary corneal edema or stromal haze. So it is always very important to see clinically and assess the clinical features and then come to a diagnosis. Also, traumatic corneal scarring can baffle you. Next. So how will we manage these cases? There are two aspects. One is to control the local inflammation to prevent pain and visually significant. Next is to identify an underlying cause so that we can reduce the systemic sequelae of the disease. Next. This is very important. In interstitial keratitis, corneal inflammation represents primarily an immune response rather than active infection. But there are prominent exceptions. If you find the cause as bacterial infections, certain bacterial pathogens, or most parasitic diseases. These are infections. So be cautious whenever next. Next. Next slide. Yeah. So the mainstay of the treatment in case of immunological etiologies are topical steroids. Which agent and what is the frequency? Everything depends on the clinical feature you are seeing in the slit lamp. It is clinical assessment, and as the underlying case may be, as you have diagnosed clinically or in the lab investigation, you have to add antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasites. Along systemic corticosteroid plays an important role because its prompt use is critical in avoiding permanent loss of hearing inability, which we can see in the sarcoid or Cogan syndrome. Lastly, when the disease is quiescent, then you can go for a visual rehabilitation with contact lens, or if the scar is very dense, then optical picking. So this is entirely the decision taken by the clinician. So if the patient presents with a picture like this, where there is only some ghost vessels and as old scar, so what you will do? You will do nothing. You will just visually rehabilitate the patient. Next slide. This slide I have put to give a caution to the audiences that interstitial keratitis is not always a immune variety. See how the acanthamoeba stromal keratitis presents, almost similar. Next. This is the microsporidial stromal keratitis. These are very virulent infections, and you have to be very cautious regarding the use of steroids. You have to go for in-depth assessment of the lesion. Next. So high index of suspicion is very much required. We should not miss the deadly infections because that will lead to catastrophe. Next. So always pay attention to the epithelium. If the epithelium is compromised and there is no substitute for the culture report, even if it is a stromal lesion, you have to send for a culture report if it is clinically not very prominent as immunological reaction. So epithelial compromise and culture report are the important clinical weapons. How do you differentiate between an interstitial keratitis and an active infection in the cornea? Next. Thank you. So I think I can.
Thank you, Dr. Sumana. It was a wonderful presentation. If I have to ask one question, what are the clinical features which suggest towards interstitial keratitis rather than the infective keratitis? Hope I'm audible there.
Yes, you are.
The most important thing, I feel, the non-involvement of the epithelium and the endothelium. Usually, if it is an infection, then the epithelial defect is usually larger than the infiltrate, as the cases may be. But sometimes you have to look very critically for the signs of infection. And if you are in dilemma, you can always go for the culture.
Okay. And if you are planning to... Hello. Yeah, and if you're planning to start the topical or systemic steroid, do you wait a few days and earlier you start antibiotic, or you straight away start the topical steroid?
No, because interstitial keratitis is mainly a clinical assessment. If you have a herpetic stomach disease, you have to add the antiviral. It comes with the clinical acumen and how you see the case. What are the other things you can pick out in the slit lamp? So if you have any doubt regarding infection, then yes, we are not going to start steroid. We will wait for the culture report. We will wait for the scraping. But in most cases, it comes at microsporidia or acanthamoeba. They are always very hard to pick. And sometimes this microsporidia also comes along with sometimes these are mixed infections. So it is not always easy to decide. But the clean cut cases of the immune variety, immunological origin that you clean can pick up clinically. You can start steroid and keep them in close follow-up to see whether you have missed anything.
I think now we are at the end of all the questions, and over to you, Satyajit sir.
Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Rajesh Fogla sir. What an amazing talk it was by you. Even the clarity and the sound was good. The presentation by Dr. Sumanna was also excellent. The postgraduates here will benefit hugely by both the presentations and all the postgraduates who later see it on YouTube. For the information of the postgraduates who are here, tomorrow we have a talk on corneal ectasia and bacterial keratitis. Tomorrow, Professor Rasik Bajpai from Australia will be talking to us, and Professor Namrata Sharma from AIMS New Delhi will be talking to us on bacterial keratitis. So once again, thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Sumanna, for this beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.